Sarah, as you know, I've been searching for God and what the meaning of life is in a very serious way through most of my life, and with successes and failures, I would say. When I've seen this new area called Analytic Theology, I was actually very excited because it sort of fit my way of thinking about the world, about using rational analytic techniques to theological questions based on philosophy and analytic philosophy, and really kind of a scientific, logical way of thinking. So I want to, from your perspective, what is analytic theology, and what is the whole process?
Well, the main propulsions of analytic theology, which is a relatively recent movement with that term, is, I think, to open up the discourses of analytic philosophy of religion to two richer conversations that arguably it has not been so strong in up to now. On the one hand, to engage in a much deeper understanding of the history of certain doctrinal tenets. Analytic philosophy of religion has quite often been accused, not without justice, of simply trying to roll up its elbows and get to work on logically on a doctrine as if it had no history, as if it had no contextualized base. And so it's now committing itself much more strongly to engagement with scriptural scholars, with patristic scholars, scholastic scholars. This is all laudable. On the other hand, it also wants to do much more creative business with continental philosophy, with which up to now it has had really very tense relationship. But if you come to think about it, analytic philosophy and continental philosophy are really only recently separated cousins. I mean, the divergence between them and the tensions between them arose only from the earlier part of the 20th century. But they then came to have slightly different priorities, to speak different languages. So I think this is a movement of rapprochement, and it's a movement of deepening of understanding of the historical contents of doctrines, but also, at the same time, with a commitment to making sure that the absolute clarity to which analytic philosophy always aspires is brought to bear on these tasks.
You are in a unique position of being both a philosopher and a theologian, both at very high levels of sophistication, and that's actually unusual. I've had the experience of talking to some theologians about philosophers of religion, about people whom I won't name but are extremely well known, and they never heard of them, even though they may be at the same university. And the differences in the ways of thinking and the worlds that they live in between theologians and philosophers of religion it kind of astounded me.
Yeah. There's a Balkanization between these subjects which has been long established, and a prejudicial resistance as well. And don't think that analytic theology isn't controversial. There are many people who think that this new attempt to bring analytic clarity to doctrinal matters is another takeover bid by the logic choppers. And I think very much depends here on the individual tone of the representatives of this movement. And I think it's important to know that the original book, Analytic Theology, contained philosophers of actually very different sorts of stripes and interests. And as you move through the original book, you find that there's a sort of widening of interest. I've been very clear that analytic theology is not a club. I think it's a movement which can have a variety of different manifestations.
Does it implicitly have a fairly incisive critique of theology, basically saying what you've done just doesn't work, it's not good enough?
Well, I think there are some people who think that's what it ought to be doing. They are the ones who are perhaps most hidebound by the idea that the great gift of analytic philosophy is to go around tidying up logical messes left by other people. Now, I'm at the other end of the spectrum within the movement, I think, in that I want to be absolutely sure that this rapprochement allows for the possibility of being absolutely clear about what you cannot be absolutely clear about. In other words, there are moments in theology where one is dazzled by transcendent mystery, moments where one is dealing with paradoxicality, which isn't a cloak for incoherence, but is paradoxical because of the subject matter you're dealing with.
Well, what's an example of that?
Well, an obvious example would be the Metaphysics of the Incarnation, where you have the extraordinary idea that the second person of the Trinity took human form, took human nature.
And when you try to explicate that and all the different ramifications, you often come up with things that sound incoherent or dead
They may
end.
sound incoherent at first blush, and I would never sign on to anything that was actually incoherent. But I think that's where the trick comes, because you're going to have to play certain cards, what I call mystery cards. You don't want to play them too soon, where you have to, say, account for the fact that the human nature that is assumed here cannot be simply another human person of a sort that we do understand, because otherwise we'd end up with two persons, and so on and so forth.
So what do you see the future? Do you see this movement in analytic theology making a significant impact on theologians? Because I think that's where the focus of interest is.
Yes. Well, of course, I want it to have an impact on philosophers as well. I think it should be two-way. But insofar as it sets up very stringent desiderata for the clarification of positions, I thoroughly support that, and I think it will have effect if people are willing to join in the game. But I think it's also very important that one of its initial desires, for instance, was to prune away metaphorical speech as somehow an unnecessary frill to what should be a more basic propositional form of speech in matters doctrinal, and that I would resist. So let's say that there's room for argument here about how the desiderata open up as we continue.
That's a really significant point, because if we just stand away from it, theology, certainly in the Judeo-Christian tradition, is based on the Bible.
Yes.
And that's where they get the ideas from which they try to do their logical moves with analytic philosophy. Now, if you go to the Bible, the original book on which those doctrines are, there's no propositions other than maybe God exists or something. There are stories. There's a million different forms. So it's radically different. So the concern that I've heard about analytic theology is that it gets its original doctrines from the Bible, but then it forgets about everything else in the Bible and how those doctrines are even explicated in the Bible.
Yeah, again, that need not necessarily happen. By the way, I think, push back and say against you that there are plenty of propositions in the Bible, but they may not be expressed in the form that analytic philosophy characteristically prefers to express. Plus, the Bible is, as you say, dripping with irreducibly rich narrative formations, irreducibly rich metaphors. And in my view, it cannot be the desideratum to end up, after explicating it, having reduced all of those to something else. Much more interesting is to look at the stages, as clearly as possible, by which this deposit of different books, different insights, different theologies became, as it were, honed and chastened and brought into doctrinal expression in the creeds and the documents of the councils. Not, of course, without remainder. They were not intended, those propositional statements, to, as it were, render the biblical narratives no longer needed, but instead were to be seen as the kind of template through which the Bible should be read. So these fears that analytic theology is a kind of reductive takeover bid, whilst not without some truth in some quarters, needn't necessarily follow.